All right. Before I officially get started, I just wanted to welcome you and thank you for joining me and your daughter. And could you remind me your name one more?
Christine.
Christine. Is it Lofgren?
Yes.
Am I pronouncing that correctly? Lofgren?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Just as a reminder, if we need to take a break or pause at any time, that's completely fine. Just let me know. We can edit anything out of the audio or video that disrupts the recording. And don't feel pressured to answer any questions that make you feel uncomfortable at all, okay? I'll get started now. I'll read a short introduction, and then I'll just ask you to tell me your story. Today is July 14th, 2022. My name is Jason Higgins. I am in Blacksburg, Virginia, at the Virginia Tech University Libraries. Joining me for today for an oral history interview is Vietnam veteran David Lofgren. This interview is part of a class project on the Vietnam War, which I taught last semester at Virginia Tech. Before we get started, I want to make sure that I have your permission to record this interview.
Certainly.
And then I always ask this question with veterans. If for any reason you needed access to counseling services, would those be available to you?
Sure.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So I'll start with a couple of biographical questions. Which branch of service did you serve?
In the Army.
In the Army? And
Regular Army.
Regular Army. And do you recall the dates of your service?
I went to Vietnam in July or August of 1970 and came back in the spring of 1971. On my way to Vietnam, I went to Panama to the Jungle Warfare Training Center, and that is counted as part of your one-year tour in Vietnam. The end of my tour was actually cut a little bit short because my mother died, and I was sent home. And they didn't give me a choice. I was in the middle of a project there of rebuilding part of the defenses of the perimeter where I was stationed, and I wanted to come back and finish that. But at that point in time, the war was winding down and people were coming home and so forth, and they said, no, you ain't coming back. So
Interesting.
I didn't quite serve a full year, 10, 11 months, something like that.
So as far as your entire military career, what were your enlistment dates and when did you retire?
Well, as I mentioned to you in our emails, my story is a little more complex than normal. I graduated high school in 1958, started at the University of Maryland, College Park, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., and I had been in the Civil Air Patrol and Boy Scouts before that and had an affinity for the military. So I wanted to be an ROTC in college. The University of Maryland had ROTC. Back in those days, it was a land grant college, what was called land grant college, received funding from the federal government, and therefore ROTC was mandatory. For all males, the first 2 years of college, unless you had previous military experience or some other kind of exemption for disability or religious or whatever, but it was a mandatory requirement, 2 years for ROTC. Well, I spent the whole 4 years in ROTC, but it was Air Force ROTC, and it was they didn't have Navy, Marines, or Army ROTC. And there were about 4,000 cadets in the ROTC program because it was mandatory. It doesn't exist anymore. But I served in the Air Force ROTC, and I was getting ready for my commissioning when I was getting ready to graduate. To back up just a little bit, I worked my way through college. So I would go to college part-time, work full-time, and then maybe work part-time and go to school full-time. So it took me 5.5 years to get through college. Not that I was either the best student either. At any rate, I went for my commissioning physical, and this would have been in late '63. And on the day of your physical, they bring, and of course, many cadets, they bring in people from doctors from all over, all the different disciplines. And I had many physicals before with no issues. But on this particular day, the doctor that examined me just happened to be an ophthalmologist. And he found a little quirk in one of my eyes, and he said, well, you're not eligible to be commissioned in the Air Force. And I said, well, I'm not going to fly. I know that. I've been wearing glasses since I was 5 years old. He said, it doesn't make any difference. Well, during the Vietnam War, the Air Force had more volunteers than they could possibly handle because nobody wanted to be in the Army.
Right.
And most Air Force jobs were, the fighter pilots are the ones that did the dangerous work for the Air Force, and everybody else just kind of assisted that. Not everybody, but at any rate, so the government was drafting the oldest first in those days. If you had a deferment for any reason from being drafted, which I did because I was in ROTC, then when your deferment ended, you went to the top of the list to be drafted. So I graduated in January of 1964, and I called my draft board and said, what's happening? And they said, your report for physical goes in the mail tomorrow. So I still wanted to be in the military. My little eye problem was not disqualifying for the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, or the Merchant Marines. just the Air Force. So the Army had just come out with a new program called the College Option Program. Officer candidate schools at that point in time were mostly sergeants who had wanted to become an officer, and they went to OCS, but they were not college-trained people. So the Army wanted to kind of upgrade the officer corps. They had many commissioned officers that had no college training at all, left over from World War II and Korea, where they just needed people who could lead but couldn't progress because they didn't have the background education to do so for the most part. Anyway, I looked into this and was accepted for that program, and it was brand new at that time. So the routine was that you went to basic training, 2 months of ordinary Army basic training, and then you went straight to OCS, which in those days was 6 months. And there was only 2 OCS schools in the Army, one at Fort Sill, Oklahoma for artillery, and one at Fort Benning, Georgia for infantry. I signed up and I went to basic training for 2 months. Then I went, the same day I finished basic training, I went to Fort Benning, got on a bus from Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and went to Fort Benning.
So let's slow down for a moment.
Okay.
So from my understanding, your dates of service in the Army were 1964 to 1992. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I didn't want to get too far into the story before I captured some of that information. But thank you for the explanation of kind of the complex path to the military. So I want to take a step back for a minute and just talk about when and where you were born.
Wichita, Kansas. January 1941, just a little bit less than a year from Pearl Harbor. My only recollection of World War II really was VJ Day, when there was a parade, and my parents took us out in the car, and everybody was driving around honking horns and celebrating. When I had finished elementary school, my father moved our family to Maryland, where he had two sisters living, and they enticed him to go east, young man, and win your fortune. So we wound up in Maryland.
What did your father do for a living?
My father in Kansas worked for Boeing, making B-17s during World War II. He actually started there before. The company was called Stearman. They made biplanes, which were used for trainers primarily. There's still some flying around today. And then Boeing bought Stearman and started making B-17s there. And he stayed there up through the time that they were making the B-47 jet bombers. But that was his. In Maryland, he did similar work for production companies, primarily doing sales kinds of things where you estimate the work and submit a contract.
Sounds like a fairly white collar, middle class background.
Yeah.
Did your mother work as well?
She didn't work until we moved to Maryland. She didn't work in Kansas. I was the second of four children. I have an older brother and a younger brother. Our sister, who was the third, is deceased last year.
My condolences.
My mother worked at, I don't know if you'd call it blue-collar work or not, but she was an electronics technician, essentially, on-the-job training. Worked for companies that, I remember her first work that she did was making coils, electronic coils, doing winding work, on a machine. And then she went to work for another company that did contract work for the Air Force and the Navy.
And this was after the war?
Oh, yeah. No, this is after we moved to Maryland.
Okay.
We moved to Maryland like in 52.
Oh, okay. Great.
Right at the time I started junior high school in Maryland.
Okay.
To put things into a linear context.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that. Well, since you mentioned school, could you talk a little bit about that? Did you have favorite subjects or any goals for education?
I was more focused on extracurricular activities associated with Scouts and with the Civil Air Patrol. We had a very active Civil Air Patrol squadron. I went to school in Annapolis. I tell people I'm an Annapolis graduate, and they say, "What were you doing in the Army?" And I said, "Well, it was Annapolis High School." So,
Tell me about Civil Air Patrol for people who might not know what that is.
Well, the Civil Air Patrol, and of course I went from there into Air Force ROTC at the university. The Civil Air Patrol is a civilian auxiliary of the U.S. Air Force. It was started way back after World War II. And it's primarily designed to create interest in aviation for the civil sector. It evolved into two different aspects. One is cadets for younger people, and then they have what they call seniors, which are for adults. And most Civil Air Patrol squadrons have an education program for the cadets, and it's like going to school. You have manuals where you learn about aviations and aeronautics and so forth. And then the adults are more involved in search and rescue. They actually have airplanes, small planes, that they use for training and orientation. And then if there's usually it's their search and rescue activities are involved with finding, locating crashed airplanes, which thankfully doesn't happen a lot. But our squadron had both seniors and cadets, and I was the cadet squadron commander in Annapolis this was right about the time I was finishing high school and going off to college.
And remind me again, what year did you finish high school?
58.
58. So you came of age kind of at the height of the Cold War context in the 50s, post-McCarthyism. Do you have any early recollections of what that was like going to high school during the Cold War?
Well, the Cold War extended well beyond.
Sure. But I mean, that. Like the height of nuclear fear.
Yeah, we did the duck and cover drills in school because if you see a bright flash, don't wait for the sound. You have to get under your desk and, cover up and so forth. Oh, no. And there were occasionally, maybe in some big cities today, you'll still see the signs that says shelter. And all over the United States, there used to be these, usually in basements of buildings and so forth, there would be these designated shelters for people to go to in case of a nuclear attack. And they would all be stocked with supplies of food and water and things to keep a certain. I don't know what it came from, but it said these were yellow and black signs, and they said Shelter S, big S, and I guess that was because the word shelter was too long. It would remind people of where to go if there were a nuclear attack. And it was a bit scary. Scary times, yeah.
Sounds like it. And so after graduating from high school, was the plan always to go into ROTC through the university and then join the Air Force? Was that your plan?
Essentially, yeah.
Tell me about your college years. University of Maryland, is that what you said?
Yeah, at College Park campus, they call it. It's right outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. I really didn't know what I wanted to do for academics. And so after a year and a half, I was just taking general courses. And then after a year and a half, I found a discipline in transportation. It was within the College of Business. I think they called it business and politics, which is kind of a strange relationship. I don't think it's that. I think they've separated that now. But it was a discipline that interested me very much, and the curriculum covered all forms of transportation. There's 5 forms of transportation. Most people don't know what all 5 are. They can think of water, highway, air, and but they miss the others. The one most people miss is pipelines. It's considered a form of transportation.
So transporting goods rather than humans.
Yeah. At any rate, I finished that curriculum and really enjoyed it. When I went into the Army then, after college, I went to Infantry Officer Candidate School, which, by the way, had a huge attrition rate because so many of the college option people we're told if you get through basic training, you can get through OCS. It's day and night OCS and basic training. We had a huge attrition rate. From the beginning of the number of people that we had in just my class, we lost over 100 people.
What were the reasons for that?
Pressure, tension. They just couldn't handle the pressure that's put on. I mean, if you're going to be in the infantry and you're going to be leading men in battle, you need to be able to think and manage your own emotions and your own abilities and skills while you're under a lot of pressure, okay? They just couldn't handle it. They were sold a bill of goods by the recruiters that it was no big deal. Well, it is a big deal. It was such a big deal that the Army changed the program. And for people who volunteered for this college option program, they had to go to basic training. Then they had to go to advanced individual training in the infantry at particular schools that were like prep school for OCS. And if you got through that, then you could go to OCS, because the attrition rate was so great that it wasn't paying off for the Army. They were investing too much with no result. So it changed. The common feeling at the time that you graduated OCS and got commissioned was, I'm glad I did it, but if somebody paid me $1 million to do it again, I wouldn't. That was the common feeling. But it gave you a good feeling that you prevailed.
Can you talk about the day that you prevailed, that you were commissioned as an officer?
In
the graduation from officer candidate school?
Well, I got commissioned in October of 1964.
So that was right after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, right?
Yeah. We hadn't. To give you a perspective, when I went to OCS, there was one battalion with 5 companies of OCS at Fort Benning. Not all 5 companies were in cycle at the same time. When I went back to Fort Benning a couple of years later, I actually went for a good friend of mine was killed in Vietnam, and I went back to Fort Benning to actually this was probably 68 maybe, and this guy was killed in Vietnam, and it was several years after he was killed. He was killed early in our involvement there, and his wife was, very young wife, was getting remarried, and she remarried another Army officer, and I went to Fort Benning. 6 battalions of OCS were at Fort Benning at that time. That's how much OCS expanded in order to feed officers into the Army for for the Vietnam War.
So you were right at the brink of that escalation, then. Can you tell me about what it felt like that day, knowing there might be a possibility of an invasion of South Vietnam? Or did you know that there might be that possibility?
We didn't really know. I remember that, again, my OCS class was mixed. We had people that were enlisted that applied to OCS and went. Most of them did really well because they knew what the Army was about and they were prepared for it. Then we had the college graduates. I remember that one of our more academic requirements during my OCS time was to read a book, a military-themed book, and then you had to make an oral presentation. And I read Bernard Fall's book, The Street Without Joy, because I thought to myself, Vietnam is coming. Don't read a book about World War II. Read about what's coming. So I read the book, Street Without Joy, which you're probably familiar with. Very good book.
Prophetic.
Yeah, very prophetic. And it of course explained the French debacle with trying to recolonize Vietnam after World War II, when the Vietnamese had worked with us to defeat the Japanese, and then we wanted to recolonize. I say we, the French did, but we didn't fight the French in doing that. We
supported them, actually.
We supported them with a lot of materiel, primarily. But we had already been involved in Vietnam since the end of World War II with the French behind the scenes. And I thought, this is coming. So that was my focus during Vietnam, was to prepare for that. And they had already started some training. Some of our training had been altered a little bit to include more Asian type environment for war, as opposed to in moving the focus away from Europe, which it had been since 1917, World War I. So anyway, I graduated from OCS October 1964, and I was ordered to Fort Ord, California, which was a big Army training base for basic training and advanced individual training for infantry. And I was assigned as a platoon leader in an AIT, Advanced Individual Training, infantry company. And that, right after I got there was a meningitis outbreak, which was, they have them in college campuses where young people are in close proximity, and the same thing for the military. We were still in World War II barracks at that time. So they stopped training for a while. There was a hiatus in training. It made the newspapers more than what the Army wanted, so it was a PR thing to close down training until this all passed over. During that time, this cadre, the staff of these companies, didn't have much to do. So I did two things. I went back to Fort Benning and went to airborne school. Went back to Fort Ord. That was just temporary duty. Back to Fort Ord. And to keep the infantry guys busy, the cadre, the post G3 put on an EIB, the Expert Infantryman's Badge, testing. And it was pretty rigorous, but I earned the Expert Infantryman's Badge at that time. And by the time that was over, then the AIT started back up again.
So by the time you were actually training other soldiers, you had done airborne school as well. Was there that lingering affinity toward the Air Force that was behind the airborne training for you?
Not really. As a matter of fact, I was glad to be in the Army. In the Army, especially if you're an infantry officer, you're considered a first-class citizen. In the Air Force, if you're not a pilot, which I wasn't going to be, you're a second-class citizen. And I don't mean that disparagingly. It's just that's their hierarchy. That's their that's just their structure, their organization. I mean, you look at every general in the Air Force. I say every. It's changed these days because of the Space Force and so forth. But in the time I was in the Army, there wasn't a general in the Air Force who didn't have wings of some kind. And it didn't make any difference if that general was serving in a logistics duty or he was a air division commander. He had wings. I know there's some blue suiters out there that would debate me on that, but I felt real comfortable in the Army. I was glad that I was in the Army, and I was in the forefront of what the Army does.
Did you have goals of rising through the ranks at that time?
No. No.
What were your goals then?
My goal was just to serve and do the best I could. And what came from that would come from that. I mean, there's a hierarchy in the Army as you advance, as with tenure, that there's different schools that you go to become more qualified. As your duties change, as you advance in your rank change, I mean, you go from platoon leader to company commander to, battalion, staff officer training and so forth. And I went to a number of schools in the Army along the way.
I wanted to ask this earlier, but where did that motivation to serve come from? Did you have a family history of military service?
Not really. I had an uncle. On my mother's side of the family, I had an uncle that served in the Marines World War II. On my father's brother served in the Army Air Forces in the Pacific in World War II. I didn't have a lot of contact with either one of those in my younger years. The motivation to serve, I think, just came from, I liked it. I thought it was an adventure, and I don't mean to say that was without patriotism. I think I got a lot of that from my dad working at Boeing, being in the Scouts, duty honor country. I think that's where the motivation came from.
So I'm curious about the time in between 1964 and your deployment to Vietnam in 1970. That's quite a long time. So I'm curious, with training all of these men, most of whom probably deployed to Vietnam, was there a sense that you wanted to deploy with those men?
Yes. And this is where the story becomes a little complex. Mm-hmm. In 1966, the duty commitment graduating OCS is 2 years. 2 years from the time you graduate from OCS, you have a service commitment of 2 years. I was coming up on that 2 years when I was still at Fort Ord. And by this time, I'm a second lieutenant. I'm still a second lieutenant because the time in grade was much greater than it was during the Vietnam War. In 1966, I didn't know whether I wanted to. The pay in the Army in those days was miserable. Every NCO in my company had a part-time job in the civilian economy because they couldn't live on what the Army paid them. And even as an officer, my pay was less than $200 a month. And I'm a company commander at this point. I'm still a second lieutenant. In between my time as a platoon leader, the battalion actually assigned me to the battalion headquarters as an S3. In most Army battalions, that's a major's job. a senior captain or a major, and I'm a second lieutenant. Shows you how shorthanded everything was. One day I'm sitting at my desk monitoring training for the whole battalion. No computers, of course. Everything's on a big board with things you move around and write on. And anyway, the battalion commander, who received a battlefield commission in Korea, great guy, it was right after lunch, and he comes to my desk and he says, "Lofgren," and of course I jump up, and it's nice military deportment in those days that kind of dampened as time goes on. "Yes, sir." And he says, "Can you command a company?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Follow me." 5 minutes later, I was a company commander. He had relieved a captain who had come back from Vietnam and essentially had lost his marbles. He was doing things in the company that weren't part of the training schedule, and was very it was against all the things.
Regulations.
He was getting volunteers to conduct patrols through the garrison area of the post, pretending that they were in Vietnam and things like that. Anyway, so here I am, a second lieutenant. I given 5 minutes notice that I'm going to be a company commander. And our company did very well. We won every award on post for the best scores for your training cycle for land navigation, weaponry training, and so on and so forth. We did very good. But this is like 1966 now, and my service is coming up, and I have to decide whether to stay or go. So I said, I don't know. So I extended for 6 months, which you could do. And during that time, I met my wife, an Army nurse, and we got married, and she got pregnant, and I said to myself, I cannot support a family on what the Army is paying me. So I got out. I went to work for a trucking company, not as a driver and in management. In Laurel, Maryland, there was the company was Roadway Express. It was a huge truck terminal that delivered and processed freight for Baltimore and Washington, D.C. metropolitan areas. We had 150 doors. You could put 150 trucks at this one terminal at one time. Big. Anyway, I started working for them. But I started missing the Army, and so I joined the Maryland Army National Guard Special Forces Company. I had the airborne training, I had the infantry training, so I was qualified to. I didn't have the Special Forces modifier for my infantry OCS, for my infantry MOS, Military Occupational Specialty. I didn't have it yet at that point in time. I had to, at that time, all I had to do was take a correspondence course in Special Forces organization, mission, modus operandi, so to speak, and then I would be Special Forces qualified. But that reminded me, being in the Guard reminded me of how much I really, really liked the Army, and I wanted to go back. So I was living right outside of Washington, D.C., so I contacted the Pentagon with a local phone call, and I talked to the Transportation Corps people. I had actually applied for commission in the Transportation Corps from Infantry OCS, but was commissioned infantry. Anyway, strange little story. There were two guys in my OCS company who had been truck drivers for the Army before they went to OCS, and they got commissioned in the Transportation Corps. I had a degree with a major in transportation, and I got commissioned in the infantry, which was great. It turned out to be perfect because you're trained in the basics of the heart of the Army. You know what drives the Army, and that's the infantry. So I had that training behind me, which I think made me a better logistics officer in the Transportation Corps as an end result. But anyway, I contacted the Pentagon. This would be 1969 now. I contacted the Pentagon and said, I'd like to come back on active duty, but I'd like to be in the Transportation Corps. Sign here. It was a done deal. Right. Okay. But they couldn't commission me in the Transportation Corps, but they could put me on what was called a detail. In other words, you're an infantry officer, but you're assigned to the Transportation Corps for duty. I was sent to, and this is the fall of September actually of 1969. I went to Fort Eustis, Virginia, which at that time was the home of the Army Transportation Corps. And I went to what was called the Transportation Corps Officers Orientation Course. It was for officers who were transitioning into the Transportation Corps. They were already officers, but they didn't have the technical Transportation Corps background. And so I went to that school. And then I was assigned to Fort Lee, Virginia, to command the only trucking company at Fort Lee. And this is tied to Vietnam. I commanded a trucking company there, and it was the only one at Fort Lee. And of course, Fort Lee is the home of the Quartermaster Corps at that time. And this trucking company was what was called a Reforger company. Reforger was a program during the Cold War called Return of Forces to Germany. And that was units in the United States that were designated to rapidly deploy to Germany when the Russians came through the Fulda Gap. However, and I had a full table of organization and equipment. I had a full organization. I had all the equipment of a light medium truck company, which is what it was. But I didn't have all the soldiers that are required. It was called an MTO, in other words, a modified table of organization and equipment. So we had all the equipment, but not all the soldiers to man all the equipment. You're supposed to pick those up when you deploy. However, Fort Lee was it's a training base. It trains all the soldiers for the Quartermaster Corps. Everything from bath and shower to food service. Now, my company, being the only transportation outfit on the post, was assigned to run 2 motor pools on post. We ran all the transportation for the entire post. 2 motor pools. One was for tactical equipment, and one was my motor pool from all my tactical equipment. And then the other one was for administrative use vehicles, trucks, buses, sedans for taxi cabs, and all that stuff. So I had not enough soldiers to run my tactical equipment, and I had even fewer because I had to siphon those off to run the motor pool and drive all this equipment to support the post. We drove, for instance, my soldiers drove all of the buses that carried the quartermaster students around for all their training, and even furnished the staff cars for the senior people on the post. My company was attached to a quartermaster battalion, and by this time, we're well into the Vietnam War. We're 1969, moving into 1970. Promotions for officers had changed dramatically. 1 year as a second lieutenant, 1 year as a first lieutenant, and if you volunteered to stay an extra year, they made you a captain. So you could be a captain in 3 years. That doesn't correspond to your ability. It's too fast.
Yeah.
The battalion S3s, now that's the operations sector of the battalion, is the one where my company got all of its assignments from. They would come from post headquarters down to the battalion and to my company. And I was constantly fighting them because I had soldiers that got 1 day off every 2 weeks. That's how, and this is peacetime, okay? Well, it's Vietnam War, but we're not in war at Fort Lee, Virginia. And I'm constantly fighting the battalion of, you're overtasking us, the soldier, the morale is going down to the bottom of the ocean, you know, where the whale shit is. I could see that I was butting heads with the battalion XO, who was a quartermaster corps major. And he was getting reports from the S3 that Lofgren's company can't do this. They don't have enough, and he didn't want to tell the higher ups that we were going to refuse a commitment from the headquarters or something. So he was constantly calling me on the carpet. He'd literally get on the telephone and say, "Lofgren, get up here." And so I was trying to protect my soldiers to the maximum extent I could, but they didn't want to hear it. They just wanted to satisfy the upper echelons. So I said to myself, this isn't going to turn out well. So I called the Pentagon and I said, I want to go to Vietnam. And they said, well, you know, you don't have to. We're not really in a real hurt for people in Vietnam at this point. It's 1970 now. And things are, you know, the program called Vietnamization, where we're trying to turn everything like we did in Afghanistan. We're trying to turn everything over to the Vietnamese so they can fight their own battles with the communists. And I said, no, I want to go. I knew that was the only way I was going to save myself from disaster, and I didn't like that. That was a big conflict because somebody needed to help these soldiers and protect these soldiers, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to do it. And in my exit interviews, I made that clear when I left Fort Lee. So I went to Vietnam. As I explained before, I went to Jungle Warfare Training Center, and then
sorry, I was just checking that.
Went on to Vietnam.
Tell me about arriving in Vietnam.
Well, you get this long airplane ride, and you arrive at night, and you're on a contract flight, Tiger Airlines or somebody like that, and you're in a stretch DC-8. If you're familiar with a DC-8, it looked kind of like a Boeing 7, the original Boeing, 707, only they managed to elongate the fuselage and make it even bigger. It kind of looks unwieldy when you think about flying in it. But anyway, And you arrive at night, and all you see is flashing lights as you're flying in, and you don't know at first whether that's artillery going off or what it is. Turns out most of it is just lights. And everybody gets on it. Of course, by this time, rotating people in and out of Vietnam is just ho-hum. It's been going on for so long. I believe it's called the 90th Replacement Depot at Long Bình, Vietnam, which is outside of Saigon, kind of halfway between Bien Hoa Air Base and Saigon, where Tan Son Nhut Air Base is, where your planes come in. The replacement aircraft go in and out of. And I go to the 90th Replacement Battalion, and I'm there for 2-3 days, whatever. They issue you some equipment. Of course, you arrive in khaki uniform, which was the uniform the Army was wearing in those days. Khaki pants and shirts. I'm a captain at this point. As a matter of fact, I got promoted to captain about 3 days before I left the Army in 1967. At any rate, I left the active Army. I was at the 90th Replacement Depot there. And when I arrived in Vietnam, I thought, even though I'm on a detail to the Transportation Corps, my primary military occupational specialty is small unit commander, infantry, which means company commander.
So how many men would have been under your supervision in that role as a company commander?
Well, the first company I commanded, the second lieutenant at Fort Ord, we had about 200.
Okay. In Vietnam, was it about the same?
Well, this is an evolutionary thing in Vietnam because I held more than one job in Vietnam. But I mentioned the infantry MOS because I held 2 MOSs at that point, infantry and transportation.
Right.
I'm on a detail to the Transportation Corps, but my primary duties are infantry. So I thought when I got to Vietnam, sure enough, the personnel people who make assignment, you don't have an assignment until you get there. You're just a replacement coming in. You don't know what you're going to do, where you're going to be assigned.
Was there ever any interaction with the people you might have been replacing?
Later on, I'm still in the replacement depot at this point, and I'm thinking, and you have to go for interviews and so forth. And I'm thinking, sure as heck, when they look at my records and they see I'm a qualified infantry company commander, although I just finished commanding a transportation company, they're going to say, we know where we're going to send you, to the infantry, which would have been fine. Okay, I would have accepted that. But I'm looking long term to spend now the rest of my professional life, my adult life, in the Army. And transportation was my forte. But they didn't. They assigned me to a transportation. They assigned me to the 4th Transportation Command, which had headquarters right there at Long Bình. And I was assigned to the G3. It's a general officer command. At that point in time, they had a colonel commanding. They didn't have a general, but it's a general officer command. And they assigned me to the G3 operations. We had multiple battalions of trucks stevedore companies that loaded and offloaded ships, boat companies, landing craft that took supplies up rivers and everything. Anyway, the G3 coordinates all this. And I did that for until about, I think, sometime around Christmas. And I then became, I was called in, much like I did the first company I commanded. I was given 5 minutes notice, and I became the commander of the headquarters and headquarters company of the 4th Transportation Command, which was still at Long Bình. And that's what I did. And you did not get any crossover with the person that you're replacing. If you did, it was a day.
Right.
Yeah.
Not to go too far away from the topic, but is that the time whenever you were first exposed to Agent Orange?
I never knew I was exposed to Agent Orange until I came down with diseases.
We can come back to that. To keep it chronological.
Maybe this is a point we could take a little break.
Sure. That sounds great.
Old men and their kidneys don't last long these days.
Yes, sir. So, at the end of our last half, you had arrived in Vietnam and you're starting to integrate into the unit. And this is at 1970. And in general, in the Army in 1970, 1971, morale, to quote an officer, collapsed in Vietnam. There was a lot of resistance within the ranks, drug use reportedly. And I'm curious, as an officer with no previous combat experience, integrating into a unit that had already been in Vietnam, did you experience or witness any of that type of behavior among the troops?
Absolutely.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. Most of this experience, of course, didn't happen until not when I was in the staff job, because you're kind of insulated there. Although we would often go out and check on convoys and companies loading for their convoys and so forth. But you didn't have a lot of direct interaction with individual soldiers.
Right.
When I became the company commander, of course, it's daily contact with individual soldiers. Drug use, yes. It's almost surreal, almost shades of Apocalypse Now in some ways.
Would you say it was heroin or marijuana, maybe a little of both?
Marijuana I didn't worry about. The hard drugs my company was located right on the perimeter of Long Bình. And it was the piece of the perimeter where Long Bình had been overrun during the Tet Offensive in 1968. I found it to be woefully inadequately prepared. Probably my infantry background at that point. So I mentioned much earlier in our conversation that when I had to leave Vietnam for my mother's funeral, I wanted to come back and finish that, but they wouldn't let me come back. But I was in the process of just scrounging resources and using soldiers that I had to try to beef up the perimeter there. We had strong points along the perimeter on the ground, pillbox kind of things with shelter over them because soldiers had to be out there all the time. And then we had what they call guard towers. My soldiers didn't man the guard towers. There was another company that did that. It was this will give you a feeling for what was going on. the guard company was an ad hoc thing. It's not part of the Army's normal force structure. It was run by a military police captain. The soldiers were all rejects from other units who the soldiers were found to be a hindrance to the operations of those units, mainly from the field. And so they said these soldiers were impeding the mission accomplishment, so they got rid of them. Well, they sent them back to Long Bình, and they became the guard tower soldiers. Well, that's almost like putting the fox in with the hen house. But even my soldiers that were manning the on-the-ground posts, I would find the heroin came in vials, little plastic vials, and I would find them all over the place. If I sold all, if today I could sell all the heroin that I destroyed, I'd probably be a rich man. Okay. The Vietnamese would come up to the wire. The soldiers would throw things over the wire, cigarettes, whatever they could scrounge, and the Vietnamese would throw the vials back over the wall. That's every evening in the company, the soldiers would. I sent a lot of soldiers every day by bus from Long Bình to Saigon, and they worked in the port at Saigon, and then in the evening they would come back. The operations were 24 hours at the port, but they would exchange shifts. And in the evening, the soldiers would separate into two principal groups, the druggies and the alkies. And
Meaning alcoholics? Yeah.
Well, not alcoholics, but those that
drink,
partook alcohol as opposed to drugs.
I see.
And the soldiers were pretty clever in how, you'd go into the soldiers' quarters sometimes and you'd do a little shakedown, but they would always have the drugs in a common area. So you couldn't, I don't know where that came from, so you just dealt with it the best you could to try to keep a lid on it, but there was no real controlling it. But I did catch one sergeant with drugs, and I busted him out of the Army. I had to set an example. He was a good soldier. But when you catch him red-handed with drugs, you can't ignore it, or everybody thinks it's acceptable. And of course it's not. So Vietnam to me is it's not something that I know a lot of people, and I didn't experience combat in Vietnam. I mean, I was in some situations where artillery was coming in close to where I was, but I personally didn't engage in combat. And I know that some soldiers, even today, still have problems dealing with their experiences there. I forget about it. It was a time in my life where everything just didn't seem to fit. Nothing made sense. So you just get through it and move on. That has been my feelings about Vietnam.
Very interesting and well said. I'm curious if you ever interacted or had any type of observation of Long Bình Jail while you were stationed in Long Bình?
I did.
Can you talk about that?
I very much did, yeah. my most prevalent experience, my most prominent experience with Long Bình Jail, we had a lot of racial tensions also during Vietnam War. When I took over command of this headquarters company of the 4th Transportation Command, the colonel who was commanding in place of a general told me that he had this soldier who was a very much of an activist, if you want to call it that, for equality and social rights of blacks and so forth. And he belonged to me as in my company. But the colonel had given him a blank check to do what he could do to help improve racial relations. Well, the guy turned in to be an outright militant. He wasn't a good advocate for racial harmony. Mm-hmm. He in fact was a proponent of racial conflict. He was always going around saying, you can't make the soldiers do this, you can't do that, otherwise he's trying to tell me how to do my job and so on. But I'm cooperating with the colonel, and I'm cooperating with this guy too. And he's constantly wanting to go to Saigon. In Saigon at that time was a group of civilian American lawyers who were advocates, pro bono advocates, for soldiers who claimed they were being mistreated or treated wrongly in some way. And this guy was always wanting to go in and consult with these lawyers and so forth. That's okay. But at night, I found him at night having meetings with blacks and, raising, advocating militancy, advocating you got to fight back. You can't do that. They can't make you do this. They can't make you do that. The bottom line was we weren't making any improvements. And the colonel told me, okay, curtail, pull this guy's leash back in and so forth. I thought the idea was a good one. I thought the colonel giving this guy a carte blanche to try to improve things was a good thing. So I wasn't fighting this guy at all. I mean, it wasn't like there was some other work that needed to be done that wasn't getting done because he was doing this. So I didn't have any axe to grind with him or anything like that. But all he was doing was increasing tensions instead of ameliorating them. And I shared this with the colonel, and he said, "Okay, let's stop it." When I called the soldier in, and I told him that it's over. We're gonna. And I don't remember the exact details, but he actually refused. He actually, I said, I said, "You understand, this is not a request. This is an order. I refuse. I'm not going to do it." So I had him arrested, refusing a lawful order, and took him to Long Bình Jail. Well, at Long Bình Jail during the in-processing, there's a military police first lieutenant who's checking him over, and they spread eagle on the wall, and they're patting him down, and this guy is just spewing vehement profanity, and at the point in time, he tells the first lieutenant, he says, I'm glad I'm here, because now I'm going to organize this place. At that point in time, the lieutenant, who has a billy club, and the guy spread on the wall, takes the billy club in between his legs and goes bop with the billy club. And of course, the soldier just crumples to the floor. And then, by protocol, I'm supposed at that point in time, I leave. But I'm supposed to go visit him once a week in Long Bình Jail. So I go to visit him, and he's in isolation. It's a particular place within the jail complex. Are you familiar with a Connex box?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They've removed the doors of a Connex box and put bars for the door. And that's what he's living in the Connex box. But he's on a hunger strike. He's still going to organize this place. He's on a hunger strike. And his guard is another black soldier who's about 7 foot tall. He's a big guy. Not wired real well, but knows his job. And I said, well, he's on hunger strike. What do you do? How is this being handled? And this big, tall guy says, I get more to eat. I'll never forget that. He says, I get more to eat. In other words, they still bring him food. He refuses it, so the guard gets his food too. Didn't get much deeper into it than that as far as Long Bình Jail is concerned, but it had the reputation of being someplace you didn't want to go.
Notorious, yeah, for violence. Do you recall his name before? Sorry to interrupt, but you don't remember his name?
Okay. No. Too many miles down the road since then.
Sure.
I did hear later on, though, that he was sent back to the United States and court-martialed.
Mm-hmm.
What came of that court-martial, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But that was my only personal experience with Long Bình Jail, other than its reputation.
Now, I know that you weren't in the field in combat, but was there ever a threat of fragging of officers that you were aware of? Did you have any
absolutely.
personal experience with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Not in my company, but in the guard company, the guard tower company that I told you about.
Mm-hmm.
They had an experience with that.
Someone was threatened, or was someone actually killed?
There was constant threats. There was one attempt. Nobody is. Myself and a couple of other officers lived in a little wooden structure with a tin roof on it. And I remember one evening we were sitting around on the outside of the building drinking a beer. And in the tin roof, we hear a thump, 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 thump. And we all dove for cover because we thought sure it was a hand grenade coming down off the roof. Turned out it wasn't. It was a bottle. But somebody was sending us a message.
Mm.
I mean, that bottle didn't just drop out of the sky. So I never knew anybody that was harmed by fragging, but it was there. It was something Now I remember one incident. It was the guard company, and the officers were in their building, and their building was up on stilts because of the terrain where they were. And this military police captain that ran the guard company, I remember him telling me that one evening there was the door to their hooch, they called them, the building, opened up, and a grenade came in across the floor. Didn't go off for some reason. It didn't explode.
Mm.
But
I'm curious. I understand that you weren't in direct combat, but certainly there was a fear of uncertainty and incoming and the possibilities of danger. Did those fears and stresses have any kind of lasting effect on you after service or after you came home?
No. No. I got home from Vietnam. I just put it behind me and went on. Could it have been different? Yeah. But I did go to sleep every night with my 45 and my AR 45 under my pillow and the AR right next to me.
For most of your life, or
No. I'm talking about when I was in Vietnam.
Oh, in
Vietnam. No,
I see.
No.
That's understandable.
Yeah.
You mentioned your wife and getting married while you were in service, and you said that she was a nurse.
Army nurse. Yeah.
Did she deploy, or was she stateside?
No. She was only in the Army a short time, which I think was a disappointment to her. But any female in the Army at that time that was pregnant, out. Could not stay in the Army if they were pregnant. Now that was changed a few years later, afterwards, into the 70s. But we're talking 67 now. And that was still the women were completely separate from the men. You still had WAC companies, which had long since been dissolved, the Women's Army Corps. So the women in the military were all single, had no dependents, not allowed to have any dependents. And they're all members of a WAC company. And then during the day, they're farmed out to different jobs. But in the off-duty time, you're actually under the control of the WAC company commander or whatever the organization is, if it's big enough. As far as nurses are concerned, they were different. Nurses was the Army Nurse Corps, and they weren't treated the same as enlisted women. But the rules for your marital status and dependency status were the same.
So she had gotten pregnant with your daughter, Christine, at this time?
Yep.
How old was Christine whenever you deployed to Vietnam?
Christine was born in October of 67, and I went to Vietnam after Panama in the summer of 70. So she was not quite 3 when I went to Vietnam.
That must have been a difficult time in your family's life.
Well, we anticipated it and we prepared for it. Joanne, my wife, Christine's mother, was a very stalwart person, a very she could handle herself. She didn't need a lot of support. She was very stalwart person as far as her personality was concerned.
Sounds like a strong woman.
Yeah, she was.
Did you stay in touch with her while you were deployed? How did you stay in touch?
Yeah, we letters, of course, and we bought these little tape recorders. They had these little reel-to-reel tape recorders, and they're about 6 or 8 inches square, something like that. And they use these little 3-inch spools of magnetic tape, and you record it. Or did they use cassette tapes? No, I remember they were little 3-inch spools, and we exchanged those. bought them through the PX. And I met with Joanne twice during my tour in Vietnam. Around Christmas time, I think it was just before I took command of the headquarters company, she flew to Bangkok, and I caught a military hop over to Bangkok, and we had a week there in Bangkok together. Did some touring around. And then several months later, I came up for my normal R&R, which everybody got from Vietnam. And we met in Hawaii. So we got Christine, and by this time she has a brother, younger brother, and they stayed with relatives while Joanne came over to visit. So we got to do that. That kind of puts a damper on the surrealism of Vietnam.
In what way?
Well, you meet with your wife and you get to spend time together, and it kind of brings you back to reality.
Interesting.
From what's, I mean, I'll give you one example of surrealism in Vietnam. Logistics in Vietnam there's two ways primarily for logistics to be handled. One is a push and the other is a pull. Okay. Pull is when the people who need things ask for them. Okay. The push is, we're going to estimate what you need and just start shoving it to you. Well, that's what Vietnam was. We're just going to estimate what you need and just push stuff. So there was stuff all over the place. I mean, there's hardly any tracking of material. The company I commanded there had a motor pool. Again, it was an ad hoc thing. We were authorized it, but they didn't give us the resources. So we were gather stuff from wherever we could get it. I'm talking about trucks, buses, anything you could think of. One day I went down in the motor pool while doing my rounds of the company area. And I asked the motor sergeant, I said, well, what's going on here today? And he says, oh, just routine things. We're just doing routine things. And I said, what's going on in there? Is the service bay. He said, oh, we're just doing some painting on a Jeep. And so I walked over there and looked, and it was an Air Force Jeep, and they were painting it Army green. They'd gotten it somehow. They're constantly doing trading of things. What have you got that I need? Okay, what do you need? I'll give you this if you give me that and stuff.
Sure.
And I had a supply sergeant that had been in Vietnam for like 4 or 5 years, because it was just his environment. He was this the ones you hear about from World War II, the scroungers that can find anything you need whenever you need it and so forth. So that's the surrealism part of it. You think of the Army as being, every T dotted or I dotted and T crossed and so forth. Vietnam wasn't anything like that.
You mentioned Vietnamization earlier, and this is a stage where a lot of not only training is going on with ARVN troops, but also supplying. Can you talk about your experience with that? Did you have direct experience with ARVN?
I didn't. I didn't. I had on Long Bình, and the only reason I could figure that the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong didn't attack our base more is because it was where they were getting their supplies, or a lot of their supplies. Not talking about in terms of weapons and ammunition, because that stuff was a lot more tightly controlled, although they got a lot of it by attacking convoys. But we had a lot of just like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, we hired a lot of locals to do ordinary routine things. And every day there were busloads of Vietnamese nationals coming into Long Bình to do work. In my company orderly room, I had a university-educated Vietnamese lady that was my secretary, for lack of a better term. And they did all kinds of chores around, clean the barracks and all of this other stuff. But I feel that a lot of those Vietnamese people were also the conduit to the Viet Cong for information as well as a lot of stuff. They figured out ways to get through it. I watched a demonstration one day at Long Bình of a Chu Hoi. You know what a Chu Hoi? Okay. Chu Hoi was a Viet Cong that had come in from the cold, so to speak. He saw the light and was working with the South Vietnamese and the Americans. And this guy had been a sapper. And we have this triple concertina wire. And I watched him go right through it. So there was ways of getting around every kind of barrier that we could put up. They would find a way to get around it. Interesting conclusion there.
I'm curious about your thoughts in general on the war. You mentioned that you had read Bernard Fall, so you had, I don't want to say an exceptional understanding, but probably more than most did before going into Vietnam about the deeper history of the independence movement and U.S. support of the French reconquest. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on U.S. intervention in Vietnam.
Good question. My thoughts were too many politicians involved in conducting the war in Vietnam. I mean, when you got the President of the United States deciding when to bomb and where to bomb and how to bomb, that's bullshit. You're going to go to war? Let the military people go to war. War is an extension of politics. You can't work things out peaceably, so you go to war. Initially, my thoughts about Vietnam were, we're talking about communism, the dominoes falling and so forth. That, to me, that was a plausible scenario. It was happening in a lot of places. And there's this sizable population that didn't want to be communist. Of course, we all know about the corruption in South Vietnam and all that. But what government doesn't have corruption in it, even our own? So you have to weigh things. And the way I weighed it out was that it was a good thing to do, but it was not conducted properly. In other words, Lyndon Johnson didn't want adverse political fallout, so he never called up the Guard or the Reserves for Vietnam. They just blew the army out of proportion, okay? That's why we went from OCS at Fort Benning from 1 battalion to 6 battalions. And these people aren't fully trained. They're not they're not your standing army. The people who went to war that were drafted in World War II received far better, more concentrated training, I think, than for Vietnam. So it just evolved into this political morass, the body count thing. To me, it was all superficial. It didn't really have anything to do with the conduct of the war. The conduct of the war should have been defeating the enemy. And you can't have, to me, there's no such thing as a little bit of war. It's like being a little bit pregnant, the old analogy. If the North Vietnamese are invading the South, then the North should be invaded, But we didn't want to upset the Chinese or the Russians, then don't do it. Just don't do it at all then. So to me, Afghanistan was Vietnam deja vu entirely. And it turned out the same. It turned out the same, in the last day as the country's being overrun and the helicopters and airplanes are panicking to get people out and so forth.
So you're referring to the August 2021 fall of Kabul. I'm curious about parallels between the fall of Saigon. Do you remember how you felt that day whenever you watched the collapse of ARVN forces in Saigon?
Well, as a professional soldier, you see that as the defeat, as the final nail in the coffin. You see the entire effort as a failure. So it was difficult but the reality was that it is what it is. It was what it was, and you just have to move on. But being of the post-World War II generation, with a little smear on our military record from Korea, but we came out of that one as good as what we went into it. In other words, the result of the Korean War was actually better than what it was before the war from the standpoint of security for the South. Vietnam was a loss, the whole thing. I mean, the whole country turned communist, which is what was the goal to prevent. Yesterday, I bought a toy for our dog, and it was made in Vietnam. So I think we probably would have been better off just staying out of Vietnam altogether in the first place, and capitalism would have eventually, I can't say democracy, but capitalism would eventually have, like it has China, improved the life of the people there, and Vietnam is no threat to the United States. Can't say that about China, but no, I think your question was, how do I feel about what happened in Vietnam? And I don't feel very good about it. I feel that no soldier should feel any disparagement or any remorse or anything defeating about their service there. They did what their country called them to do, and did it, most of them, to the best of their ability. Some 50,000 gave their lives doing it. And I've been to the wall, and there's people I know on the wall.
That's what I wanted to ask. How do you memorialize the war?
In individuals. the people that I knew that did their job and did it the best they could, some of them giving their lives. I don't look, I don't memorialize it as any kind of achievement for the United States, or an achievement for the U.S. Army, for that matter. I think it's the service of the individuals doing their duty is how I think about it.
Do you want to take a break?
No, I'm okay, thanks.
When was the first time that you visited the wall?
It wasn't too long after it was made. A very moving memorial, very fitting. There's some controversy about people who have died not in battle, but as a result of the war, but their names aren't on the wall.
How do you feel about that? Do you think the Agent Orange victims should be memorialized in some way?
No, not really. I've got two kinds of cancer from Agent Orange. Neither one curable. One is non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which was, I started having problems because of it when I was still in the Army, but it couldn't be diagnosed. It was only after I left, about 3 years after I left the Army, that I had to have surgery and it was diagnosed. So that was 1995, so I've survived that, although it's come back a couple of times. And I've had to have more treatment. The biggest problem was that the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma presented through malignant lymph nodes that infiltrated my small bowel. Mm-hmm. So I've had to have 3 bowel resections, 3 small bowel resections to cut out bad places in my small bowel that doesn't allow anything to get through. And next week I get my 3rd surgery on top of that for complications resulting from the previous surgeries. Right now I've got a big hernia here, which is an incisional hernia where something broke loose from one of the previous surgeries. And that's what I'm going to have repaired next week. I also now have metastatic prostate cancer. And the way it presented is most definitely an Agent Orange result. Most ordinary prostate cancers present with prostate problems, specifically enlarged prostate that cause other symptoms. Mine is still very small. Today, it's very small. But 90%, 99% of prostate cancers are diagnosed while they're still within the prostate. Mine wasn't diagnosed until it was already spread to the lymph nodes. So I'm getting treatment for that. Do I hold any grudges about that or any sour grapes or anything? No, maybe I'm just too realistic of a person that humans make mistakes and other humans have to suffer the consequences of those mistakes, and that's where I am.
Did you ever have any difficulty getting the VA to recognize those health problems or getting disability benefits for those?
No. I was already getting 100% disability for the lymphoma. And when I told my VA doctor about the prostate cancer, he says, well, you can get 100% disability for that. He says, but you can't get 200%. So the state of Virginia does very well helping veterans. And when I learned that the lymphoma was a presumptive Agent Orange cause, I just turned it over to them, and they took care of the whole thing. I signed a piece of paper that says, you're my agent for this purpose, and they took care of the rest. I haven't even filed anything with the VA for the prostate cancer because that won't do any good. I don't use, the VA here in Salem is hit and miss on medical care. I was using them for treatment of the lymphoma until they don't have any cancer doctors anymore. Okay. So years ago, I started using a Korean affiliate cancer care place. So they tell me that something else is going to get me in the end, but I've already lived longer than I expected because the Agent Orange lymphoma was originally, the lifespan was estimated at 5 years, and I've long outlived that. But I follow my health care very closely, very carefully, and I monitor it well and keep the doctors pestered about making sure we're doing the right things.
Sounds like you're a very perseverant individual. Speaking of keeping the doctors accountable, a lot of VA benefits and recognition for Agent Orange is a direct result of activism among veterans organizations like the Vietnam Veterans of America, for example. Yeah. I'm curious, have you ever been involved in any organizations or active or participated in some of those campaigns?
No. Other than supporting their campaigns through sending messages to congressmen and so forth. I am a member of quite a number of organizations, ones that are not, a lot of veterans organizations are more socially oriented, I think, than they are purposeful oriented. I'm a lifetime member of the Military Officers Association of America. I'm a lifetime member of the Army Association of the U.S. Army, and I have participated with those organizations. I'm also a lifetime member of the Transportation Corps Regiment Association, National Guard Association of the U.S., NAGAS it's called, lifetime member of that from my service in the National Guard in between active Army tours. And whenever they have campaigns to support a particular benefit through activism with your congressmen or senators, I do that. But I haven't joined, for instance, the American Legion or AMVETS or Disabled DAV, Vietnam Veterans of America and so forth, because they presented themselves to me mainly as social organizations. Some of them kind of ticked me off too. I won't name them, but I looked at their financial records, and the people that run them have these really sweetheart financial benefits. Yeah. Great pay, unbelievable retirement plans and things like that. And I didn't feel that mirrored their altruistic public persona.
There's a lot of mistrust, I would say, among veterans for not only the way they perceived they were treated by the American public after coming home, but also by government institutions. And I'm curious about the memory of the Vietnam War in your life. How have public perceptions of the war changed over time?
Changed 180 degrees. 180 degrees. I think the public perception of Vietnam today is more in line with my feelings about Vietnam. They recognize that people were called to duty and did their duty. That they're not praising the reasons we were in Vietnam or the outcome of the war, which I think will mirror Afghanistan as well. I think it'll be the same thing. But, Congress passed this Vietnam anniversary thing, the 50th anniversary of Vietnam and so forth, and had all these celebrations, and the traveling wall that has moved around the country, and the Army even had a special program for a few years. It's gone now. But they have a special Vietnam service pin that they give. And you didn't have to be in Vietnam to get one of these pins. You only had to be in a military between this date and this date. And it covers from the 1950s all the way up to 1975. So I think the general public view of Vietnam has turned 180 degrees from spitting on the soldiers who are coming back from having done their duty to being a recognition of dutiful service. I think that's the public perception today, which has always been mine.
Mm. I'm curious about maybe the lasting effects of your service in Vietnam or the military more generally on your family life afterwards. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I don't think that Vietnam per se, my service in Vietnam, greatly affected the family life. Christine might have something more to say about that, but she was only 3 when I left, and not quite a year older when I came back. Well, she wasn't even quite 3 when I left. No. I left in 1970, and she was born in 67. So, yeah, she was almost 3 when I left. My wife, as I said, was very stalwart. Had she not been a very self-sufficient person, that might have been different. But my military service in general, I think, did have an impact on our family life. I think my wife would have preferred to have been a medical professional, although she fell out of. She did work some part-time work as a nurse after we were married, but she was an old school nurse from the standpoint that she liked to do things for patients. Well, nurses don't do much of that anymore today. They sit in front of computers and, and the aides come in and do things for patients. She actually went back to school. Took a long time as we traveled around the world. I mean, we were stationed in California, Virginia, Florida, Hawaii, Germany, England. All of those moves, her life was interrupted. I mean, my jobs changed, but my life wasn't interrupted. But her life was interrupted, and she she was absolutely superb at closing out the old household and opening a new one. And in retrospect, I was too focused on my work and not focused enough on the family, and her contribution to it wouldn't have happened as well as it did if it hadn't been for her. But I think if she were sitting here now and you were asking her that same question, and she deceased, she died 2.5 years ago.
My condolences to you.
Thank you. I think she would, without me in the room, she would probably tell you that she would have preferred a more stable life. I think if you would ask Christine, she would tell you that it was tough for the kids growing up. She graduated from high school in Frankfurt, Germany. Paul, my son, graduated from high school in Bentwaters, England. Christine started college in Munich at the University of Maryland. The school there, they have these extension courses all over the world. Kind of a fallout from World War II, from the occupation forces, where the soldiers wanted to go to school and on their own time and so forth. And University of Maryland is the one that proliferated all of those extension campuses. I think a lot of the tension of relocating constantly and so forth that was between me and Joanne spread to Joanne and Christine and Joanne and Paul.
Well, Christine, since I have the rare opportunity to actually ask a question, and because I am curious about how military families affect children, what perspective could you bring to the conversation, if you don't mind? Let me just extend your microphone a little bit.
In a way, I didn't know any different. I didn't have a comparison to compare it to. So it was just kind of the normal thing to do, moving around. But now I do recognize there might have been some things from not being in a stable environment, but I also very much appreciate the opportunities I got to travel around and live in other places, and to me that overrides any other issues, negative things that might have come about.
Would you say that you have a more international perspective in life?
Yes.
Interesting. I'd also, Christine, I'd like to open the opportunity for you to ask your father any questions, that a follow-up question from something throughout the interview, or something that you've thought about in general.
No, I'm very proud of my dad and how he's provided for us, and I'm proud of the person he is as a human being, his values and things like that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to thank both of you for the profound opportunity to ask you questions about your personal lives and to get a greater understanding of how war and military service in general shapes people's lives. As a social historian, that's what I'm most interested in. But as a human, I appreciate the trust that it takes to open up about some of these topics in life. So I'll start wrapping up. But I have a couple of questions in general to answer. I have all the questions, of course, as you can tell.
Shoot away.
But I'll keep them limited.
I haven't got anything else planned for today. So,
Is there so one of the reasons why we're doing this interview today is to follow up from the Vietnam War class I taught in the spring, in which students were interviewing veterans. So I'm curious if you had any words of wisdom or advice or something, a lesson that could be learned from your experiences to share with future generations of students or young people going into the military today, what would that be?
I think first I would tell people to keep an open mind about things. We all have preconceived notions about almost anything, any subject you could bring up. And I think those preconceived notions immediately place limits on what we can do and what we should do, as opposed to what we think everybody else should be doing instead of keeping an open mind about things. In my lifetime, the population of the United States has more than doubled. Population of the world has tripled in just my short lifetime. Most of the problems of the world today, I think, are due to, if you trace them to the origin, whether it's depletion of species, depletion of resources, pollution, the destruction of the planet, contentiousness in our political systems instead of cooperation, is overpopulation. But that's not the immediate question. The immediate question is, what can we do better? And I think that, to start with, whether it's abortion, which is really in the news today or not, keep an open mind about things. Don't just, this is the way it's got to be, and there's no other way. You have to keep an open mind about things. The other thing is, of course, is to don't always just live in the moment. Think about down the road. Think about the future. Where do you want things to go? Not be totally focused on the moment. And of course, that goes along with keeping an open mind about things. A little closer to home as far as individuals are concerned, I think more people have to think there's too much meism today and not enough us. I think that's a big problem with our younger societies today. I know that the old people are supposed to be packed with wisdom and everything they say is a gem to be preserved, but that's not always the case.
Well, you served your nation for 30 years nearly. That's a great time in one's life to dedicate to service of others. I'm curious about your thoughts on the current state of democracy and what you think needs to happen to move forward and from this moment in time.
That's a good question. I have an old college roommate that wound up with a Ph.D., and we often have email debates. And he's far left. I'm a centrist. There's certain things at the right that I concur with, and there's things on the left that I concur with. But do I fear for the democracy? There's a touch of that. There's a touch of that. I feel that those who are a threat to the democracy are in Washington, D.C. It's not the Proud Boys. It's not the leftists who were burning down police stations because they didn't like the killings that police did and so forth. They thought they were unjustified and so forth, although some of them were. But the threat to our democracy is the inability of our politicians to serve the nation instead of serving themselves. That's just a personal view. They're constantly wanting to change the rules in order to promote their personal agenda, and that's wrong. You know, they're not seeing the whole picture. A lot of the political cartoons today have it right, that the people in Washington are only concerned about preservation of their supposed power. One of the things that we really need is a more educated and a more considered electorate. People are too much pulled one way or the other, and it's either this way or no way. I mean, you know, so yeah, do I get back to your question? Do I have a fear for the democracy? There's a touch of that there. I view the world and most situations in the world, and maybe this goes back to the philosophy part, as a pendulum. Pick your topic. I don't care what it is. Abortion, gun rights, almost anything you can think of. And think of it as a pendulum. And it swings. It never stops. It keeps swinging. It goes over here until it gets too far. And people say, nah, that's no good. And it starts coming back. But it doesn't stop. It keeps going. And it gets over here and people say, no, it's gone too far. And it starts coming back again. Now, this is years, okay, sometimes centuries, depending on what the topic is. I think we're almost up to here as far as our politics and our the threat for democracy is. I think it'll start to come back.
I hope you're right for everyone.
Yeah. I think these factious fringe groups are exactly that. I happen to concur with the January 6th investigation that's going on in Congress now. I think it should be fully laid out. But I think it should be fully laid out of not what the politicians wanted to portray, but what it really was. And that is 325 million people. And how many people were involved in January 6th? You know, it's a small thing. It's not a small thing in terms of what, if it was ignored, what it could become. But, yeah, there's some concern there. I won't get into specific issues. That's beyond your interview here.
Sure. Well, I hate to end a interview on the topic of politics anyway, because it tends to...
It's not particularly germane to your project, but...
Well, I have 3 final questions, and you don't have to answer them in great detail, but I'm curious, are there moments in your life that you look back on and you recognize that that's something you're proud of, an apex of your personal achievement, something that you think stands out as one of the greatest moments of your life?
As far as military service or anything?
Anything in general.
It would have to be a generic kind of a response, that I've been a good person, that I have done what I thought was right. I have been good to my fellow man and woman to the best of my ability. I think that's both in the military and not. I think I used my military service for good following the military. Do I deserve the Presidential Medal of Freedom or for something outstanding I did? No. I just think that the highlight of my life was knowingly doing what I thought was right when at the right time for the right reason. That's kind of an overarching response, not something very specific. To get very specific, I can't think of anything in particular other than the typical response, which would be my family.
Well, I think that's a great response, even if it's common among people. I think that's what oral history does, is it tries to capture the essence of life.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for sharing that with me.
Sure.
You kind of answered my final question, so I'll ask my second to last question, which may seem a little out of order in my mind. Is there anything throughout this interview that you wanted to talk about that I haven't thought to ask, or something that you wanted to go back to?
No, I don't think so. I know the focus was on Vietnam. It's supposed to be on Vietnam, but you have to understand the beginning and the lead up to that to know what is somebody's perception of their service from Vietnam, what led up to that, the development of your mind, the development of your deportment, the development of your sense of purpose in life and so forth, certainly impacts the hindsight view of Vietnam. I went on to serve for a good while after Vietnam, served with a lot of people who did serve in Vietnam and quite a few who didn't. Have not had any real, and I'm still in touch with some of those people long after. Never had, this is the first in-depth conversation that I've had with anybody about Vietnam service. Most Vietnam veterans just don't talk about it. And I think the reason is because they feel they didn't do anything special. I have a friend who lives in Roanoke who served as in an armored cavalry outfit in Vietnam, and he saw lots of combat. He was in the hospital just about a year or so ago as mortar fragments are still coming out of his body after all of these years. And we will talk about occasionally about the people that we knew that really gave their all. But as far as just general conversation about what did you do in Vietnam and how did you feel about it and so forth, those conversations don't come up. Or at least they haven't for me. Maybe if I was in the Vietnam Veterans of America sitting at the bar telling lies with the other soldiers that were there, maybe it would, but I've chosen not to go that route.
Well, I have to say it's been one of the most rewarding aspects of my adult life is to hear stories for the first time. So what you just told me is fairly common among the veterans I've interviewed, that this is the first time you've talked about it in this depth. So I always consider that an honor. And I'm honored by your story today. And as you talked, I did think of one final question, and because you've mentioned Afghanistan twice now. Do you have any words of advice for Iraq or Afghanistan veterans or veterans of future conflicts that might hear this interview one day?
Today, with an all-volunteer military, I would advise people not to go into it if you're not ready to put all of yourself into it. To recognize the fact that if you were the politician in charge, you might not do what the military is being asked to do. But if you chose to be in the military, then that's when you have to question yourself, not to question the duty requirement that's placed on you. In other words, you're either in or you're not. And these days, without a draft, with an all-volunteer military, if you're facing, and I think conflicts are going to be more like Afghanistan than not. The big powers just realized that the devastation that would come from a major powers all-out conflict is just untenable. The mutually assured destruction scenario. So it's going to be more of these things. But we have to learn how to get into them and out of them, and not these protracted 20 years in Afghanistan and, 15 years in Vietnam, 64 to 75, actually, about 10, 11, 12 years more if you go back to when we were assisting the French. But as far as an individual is concerned, you have to go with your own personal feelings and convictions. You have to look past the political reason for why you're there. You have to understand that the military is an extension of politics. It is, and it always has been. But when your leaders, your politicians, require you to execute the oath which you've taken, then you do it. Then you do it the best you can.
Do you think that civilian populations have a responsibility, therefore, to hold political leaders accountable?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Lyndon Johnson was not held accountable, but I think he realized it, and I think that was one of the reasons why he chose not to run again. It was because he realized he'd screwed everything up, and more of the same wasn't going to fix anything. As far as the first Gulf War was concerned, to me, that's warfare. Okay, bad guy, take him out, and you do it, and you're done. I was in Egypt at that time. I was serving as the chief logistics officer for the multinational force and observers in the Sinai in Egypt. That is the organization that was created by the Camp David Accords following the last Egyptian-Israeli war. And it's a buffer zone in Sinai to keep the Egyptians and the Israelis honest. I was there during that time. So I wasn't in Afghanistan. I mean, I wasn't in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or Iraq. But we were impacted by that war. Some of Saddam's Scud missiles, because Egypt was an ally in that operation. Some of the Scud missiles that Saddam Hussein was sending, if they plotted, Israeli rockets intercepted them, but if they plotted the arc where it was going, it would have landed in the Sinai where we were. So I got involved in that to some degree, but I wasn't in country.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is that the Powell Doctrine should be adhered to. This idea of
I greatly admired Colin Powell. I'm very saddened by his death, his recent death. I wish he was president. I wish he had decided to run for the president. I think he's one of those people that could have brought political consensus instead of preserving this divisiveness that we've had going on. So, yep.
I've heard that a couple of times, even from Afghanistan veterans, an admiration for Powell. So, I want to thank you again for your willingness to share your story, for your service to your country, and for just sitting down to me and opening up your life in this way to me. That's a profound honor to me.
Well, thank you. It's kind of a catharsis for me, too.
Excellent. I'm going to pause now.